I'm Mark Crumpton in New York. You're watching Bloomberg Technology. Here's a check of First Word News. House Speaker Paul Ryan will not seek re-election this fall. Ryan made the announcement today and said he's leaving with no regrets.
I am proud of what this conference has achieved, and I believe its future is bright. The economy is strong. We've given Americans greater confidence in their lives. And I have every confidence that I'll be handing this gavel on to the next Republican Speaker of the House next year.
President Trump is still considering possible U.S. military options against Syria. He met with Defense Secretary Jim Mattis on the matter today. That meeting comes after the president tweeted a warning to Russia to expect a barrage of missiles. The president is scheduled to meet with state governors and congressional members tomorrow to gauge the impact of his tariff proposals. The meeting comes after the president praised China's Xi Jinping for toning down the rhetoric on what some say was the beginning of a trade war. As Israel marked its Holocaust Remembrance Day, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned Iran not to test Israel. Israel is on high alert after Iran, an ally of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, threatened to respond to an airstrike on a Syrian military base on Monday that the Syrian government, Russia, and Iran blamed on Israel. I'm Mark Crumpton in New York. Bloomberg Technology is next.
In New York, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg wraps up his second day of a grilling in Washington. And on day two, questions were more pointed and answers a tad more evasive. Plus, it is the Big Apple versus Silicon Valley. We explore the New York tech scene with a top VC and a commercial real estate startup with ties to the Kushners. And renewed prospects for a deal between Sprint and T-Mobile 5 months after conversations to merge fell apart. But first, to our lead. It has been a long 2 days for Mark Zuckerberg. Still, the Facebook CEO emerged mostly unruffled after 48 hours of congressional grilling. Zuckerberg generally kept his cool, even as lawmakers downplayed his apologies over failures to protect user privacy and assurances to do better. Some key takeaways: regulatory proposals are coming, but there is no clear agreement on what they will look like or what Facebook would support. Still, shareholders seem to be relieved Zuckerberg can hold his own. In testimony, shares rose through both days of the hearing. Data collection, particularly off Facebook for those who don't use the service as well, emerged as a key concern. Joining us now to dissect the last 48 hours in Washington, Bloomberg's Ben Brody, who covers lobbying and has been following every step of these hearings, as well as David Kirkpatrick, CEO of Telecom and author of The Facebook Effect, with me here in New York. So my takeaway from day two: more pointed questions, better informed questions. Zuckerberg still generally unflustered, but a little bit more evasive and a little bit more nervous.
Well, they were really attacking him and trying hard to sort of bait him today, I felt. And you have to give him a lot of credit for equanimity. I think he kept his cool, and some of the questions he didn't fully answer, and he may have said some things that are incomplete also. Let's
talk about the things he didn't fully answer. There was a very striking exchange with Representative Ben Lugin, who asked about Facebook's practices of collecting data off the service, even for users who don't have a Facebook account. Take a listen to that exchange.
Facebook has detailed profiles on people who have never signed up for Facebook, yes or no?
Congressman, in general, we collect data for people who have not signed up for Facebook for security purposes.
So he says they collect data for security purposes, but they also collect data for advertising purposes. And I do think that is a question that actually came up over and over again that he didn't fully answer.
It doesn't seem like he really wanted to fully answer that. And that's a shame, because unfortunately, deception in front of Congress is something for which you pay a high price. I don't think he was trying to be dishonest. I think some of these things are even a little confused in his own mind, would be my guess. I mean, he probably doesn't think about that stuff very much, but in fact, there's probably more than one way, probably several ways Facebook gathers data about non-users around the internet. They have an ad network, they do that.
one of those ways is that if a website has a Facebook share option or a Facebook like button, even if you don't use Facebook, if you use that like button, they can see what you're doing, right?
If it's a Facebook like button, they can see it, yeah.
So, Ben, talk to us a little bit about this particular issue, which too many times to count, in fact, that lawmakers really seem to focus on.
Emily, I am really sorry. I don't know if you can hear me. I've actually lost my earpiece, but if you can, I'm going to talk about some of the key takeaways because I couldn't hear your question. One of the things that really struck me was that people went in a little bit more on what the privacy regulations could look like. A key question was whether we need a Bureau of Privacy here in D.C. that could kind of oversee these issues. We also heard a lot of lawmakers talking about the user agreement, that it's really complicated to understand, and that that's the kind of thing that they think should really be made a lot more plain. Now, that may play into what Zuckerberg kind of has planned here, because they do, I think, plan to roll out some changes on that privacy agreement to comply with European regulations coming into force next month. But still, it's the kind of thing that they suggested may need to be formally regulated or legislated.
Ben, thank you so much for that overview. The question I asked was about this issue of whether Facebook tracks you off Facebook, whether or not you have a Facebook account, which came up over and over again. And it is a question that I believe Zuckerberg never fully answered and certainly didn't seem to want to answer. Talk to us about how this has suddenly become an emerging concern and where you think the chips fell on that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And we got you loud and clear now. I thought that one was interesting. It was the kind of exchange that you can kind of play in a political ad. Look, this isn't just about users. This isn't just about people who consented under a particular privacy regime when third-party data could come in with your friend's data could come in with your consent. It's the kind of thing that I could see people who want to make Facebook a political issue really sort of digging down on. Now, I'm not sure how that congressman sort of got onto it, but I thought it was particularly impressive questioning. And given the number of conservatives and Republicans who were sort of coming down on Zuckerberg for his perceived liberal leanings or the platform's perceived liberal leanings, I could see them sort of making an issue of that going forward.
That was the other issue, was the content, and this is the other thing that really came up over and over again, which is how responsible is Facebook for the content on its platform. Now, we talked yesterday about how it seemed he was giving more than he has in the past by acknowledging that he believes Facebook has some sort of moral obligation when it comes to the content on his platform, but not necessarily a legal obligation when it comes to the content on that platform. And he almost backed away from that a little bit today.
Well, I didn't see every minute of it today. I mean, I didn't have 9 hours in the last, or 10 hours in the last day and a half, but I watched a lot of it. But he did say to Senator Cornyn yesterday, he did believe they're responsible for the content, which is a major shift towards that responsibility that he's never been willing to accept before. I do think this thing that so many of the Republicans were hammering with, that Facebook is, a liberal bastion that's biased against the right, is complete horse manure and not accurate at all. In fact, there's equal, if not more, critiques from the left, from centrists. Everybody thinks their data isn't sufficiently attended to on Facebook, but these people cannot accept that they're not unduly discriminated against. And in fact, there's evidence that Facebook has done things in the opposite direction, institutionally.
Now, on the issue of regulation, as I said earlier, Zuck has said over and over again, it's not a question of if, but what kind of regulation. Take a listen to what he had to say today.
I think that it is inevitable that there will need to be some regulation. So my position is not that there should be no regulation, but I also think that you have to be careful about what regulation you put in place.
So, Ben, what happens now? He has said he is supportive of regulation. He has given some indication of the general principles he would be supportive of, but when it comes to turning it into law and getting Facebook to support it, what's really next?
Well, I think two things are next. Actually, in yesterday's testimony, Zuckerberg promised that they would bring some regulatory or legislative proposals, which is pretty interesting, unusual to have a company suggest ways that Congress could regulate itself and its peers. And by the way, I think some of its peers, Google in particular, are probably pretty nervous with some of those things that Zuckerberg suggested he would be open to. But the other thing that happens now is we get proposals. There are actually a number of privacy proposals that have come through Congress in the last couple of years, but they can vary very widely. And, some of them are relatively conservative, some of them are relatively liberal. Now we get to hash out which exactly of those is going to happen. There is a political timetable here, as we say here in Washington. Nothing happens after the August recess because then you head into the election year, and you don't want to do anything that could appear, as I say, in an attack ad. So they would have to get it done in a fairly crunched time frame. I think the question is, will the momentum still be there either in a month or in 6 months after the election when they're turning back to these things?
All right, Ben Brody of Bloomberg News, David Kirkpatrick, CEO of Telecom. Thanks for hanging with us the last couple of days and getting us through it. Coming up, Firstmark Capital is one of the biggest venture capital firms in New York with investments in Airbnb, Shopify, and Pinterest. We'll talk about the investment climate in New York versus Silicon Valley with Beth Ferreira of Firstmark next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. Listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. We've been covering all angles of the unprecedented testimony of Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg in Washington the last 2 days. Since the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke, it has put serious pressure on Facebook stock, wiping out gains in 2018. Those shares did recover a little bit over the last couple of days. What about investor sentiment in the private markets, though? Here to discuss that and more, we're joined by Beth Ferreira, Managing Director at Firstmark Capital. So I'm curious, obviously I know these are, two very different worlds, but, how have you been watching what's been going on with Facebook and rising concerns about user privacy and user control over how they interact with technology?
Sure. Of course, we're watching it very carefully. Right now, I think the sentiment in the public market mirrors very much the private market. So yes, yesterday, I think people were pleasantly surprised that Mark was able to handle the scrutiny yesterday and held his own, and you saw that in the public markets. In the private markets, we feel the same way. The overarching question is whether or not there's going to be increased regulation. I think he made a good point of that increased regulation. The bigger companies like his are going to be able to weather that storm. The smaller companies, that becomes a much bigger burden for them. And so there's a question there. But ultimately, I don't see any sort of slowdown in private market investing. If not, a continued acceleration.
Are these questions you're asking about in pitch meetings? How are you collecting this data? And is this really, not necessarily legal, but, does this meet our sort of moral standard of what is possible?
Privacy has always been a concern, and so those are questions that we definitely ask when any company is collecting personal data. It's how do you use that data? And I think, Facebook has taken the stance of that they're a tools company, and that piece is not, wasn't important or wasn't part of their purview. It puts increased scrutiny on that as companies grow.
And is the public market volatility, and specifically the volatility we're seeing in the tech markets, impacting private valuations at all?
We haven't seen it, and if anything, private company valuations have been steady, if not accelerating.
So, we often compare New York to Silicon Valley. New York, I know there's a lot of exciting things happening here in the tech scene, but there still hasn't been that multi-billion-dollar exit. When will that happen? Will that happen?
So we're seeing a continued acceleration. There has been a lot of buzz in the market about New York and how it's going to grow, and we've seen over the last 5 years a big increase in the number of not only the number of companies that have been founded here, but the number of exits. And we also have a nice pipeline of potential companies that will exit at multiple billion-dollar valuations, whether it's Oscar Health, WeWork, Cadre. There are some in the pipeline. So the other question is, where are those venture dollars going? And so I get asked a lot, is New York a real market? Is there is it a competed market? And I'd say almost every single deal that we've looked at, over the last 2 years have had Silicon Valley investors competing for them.
Now, you're FirstMark's second female partner, I believe, which is awesome. And I just wrote a whole book about diversity in Silicon Valley, Brotopia. And some of the things that I've heard anecdotally are that New York is better than Silicon Valley on diversity, or New York feels like it's a more inclusive place. In fact, I talked to many entrepreneurs who left Silicon Valley to come to New York and keep building their companies here. Do you think there's any truth to that idea that New York is less of a Brotopia than Silicon Valley proper?
Well, New York has always been a melting pot, not only for the people that are here, but the industries that are here. And so, we know that 40% of tech workers here are women, 20% are people of color. So, that's a dramatic difference than Silicon Valley. So yes, I believe that here it's a little bit more diverse. There's access to different types of talent across many industries.
But what still needs to happen? It's certainly not enough.
It's certainly not enough. I think that's true. I think we need, it's still a developing market. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing really nice trends here. And I think, we'll continue to see more dollars come in here. And in the third quarter of 2017, we saw more dollars come to New York than Silicon Valley and the early stage side, so 4.2 versus 4.1. I think we'll continue to see that trend.
All right, Beth Ferrer, FirstMark Capital Managing Director, thank you so much.
Thank you
for joining us. All right, coming up, we speak to one of the congressmen who grilled Mark Zuckerberg on the Hill earlier, Representative Leonard Lance of New Jersey. Coming up next, this is Bloomberg. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's marathon questioning before Congress has wrapped. One of the representatives who gave Mark Zuckerberg a piece of his mind, Republican Leonard Lance of New Jersey. Take a listen.
Do you believe that that action violated your consent agreement with the Federal Trade Commission?
We do not believe it did, but regardless, we take a broader view of what our responsibility is to protect people's privacy.
Thank you. I think it may have violated the agreement with the Federal Trade Commission, and I'm sure that will be determined in the future.
I would like to welcome Representative Lance, who joins us now from Capitol Hill. So, Representative Lance, how satisfied were you with Mark Zuckerberg's testimony today?
I asked him a direct question, and Emily, he responded, and I tend to disagree with his response. And the Federal Trade Commission is now investigating the matter, and I hope that the investigation occurs in a timely fashion.
So what are you most concerned about?
I'm concerned about the privacy of the American people, and certainly the privacy of the American people was violated in this situation, and moving forward, we have to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
So do you think that more regulation is necessary?
I am a co-sponsor of a bill sponsored by Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, the browser bill, and that would have a system that would be more protective of the privacy of the American people, and you would have to opt in, and I think that's the way we should proceed. And the browser bill is for all forums, not just edge providers, but also ISPs, and I think that is the way to proceed.
Beyond the browser bill, is there any regulation that you would support, given that, there are a wide range of topics at play here, beyond privacy?
I want to make sure that companies have the ability to innovate, but that does not mean that they should be in a situation where they invade the privacy of the American people. And certainly Congress wants to make sure that that does not occur. I think the browser bill would go a very long way in that regard.
Now, Speaker Paul Ryan now reportedly won't run for re-election. I feel like I have to ask you about this since we have you. Do you think that's good or bad for the Republican Party?
I think that the Speaker will continue to be involved to the highest extent in his responsibilities till the end of the year. He will remain Speaker until the end of the year. He will continue to be engaged in fundraising, for example. I wish him and his family well. And Emily, I think this was a personal decision based upon the fact that he wants to help raise his children in Janesville, Wisconsin. This is a very cynical town, and there are all sorts of explanations. I believe the speaker when he says that he wants to be involved in the raising of his children with his wife, Jana. Moving forward, he is going to be working on behalf of Republicans across the country over the course of this year. And then there will be a new speaker come January.
Do you believe it has anything to do with friction with the president?
I do not. I believe it has to do with the fact that Paul is a young man. He's 48 years old. He has a whole life ahead of him. He will be very successful in whatever he does, and I take him at his word. He and his wife are raising their 3 children in Janesville, Wisconsin, and he wants to be more involved with that.
Now, back to Facebook going forward. I know you've got the browser bill, but bigger picture, how much of the responsibility to protect, to self-regulate falls on Facebook, and how much do you think this falls on Congress and the law?
I think it's a combination of both, and the COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, last week indicated that she thought the company had not done as good a job as it should do, and that is obviously the case. And Mr. Zuckerberg, in effect, said the same thing both to the Senate yesterday and to the House today. And therefore, I think we should move forward with the browser legislation, and we should not rely on what Facebook or any other company says, because it's the responsibility of all of us working together to protect the privacy, not only of the American people, but really of people across the globe, because this affected not only citizens here in this country, but those across the globe as well, and that's why the British Parliament is investigating this matter as well.
I interviewed Sheryl Sandberg last week, and she also told me that Facebook's business model is not going to change, and this is a company that has built a multi-billion-dollar business leveraging data that users, that we share with Facebook. They said repeatedly they don't sell that data, but they rent that data in order to target advertising. Knowing what we know now, does it concern you that the business model will remain as is?
I think the business model might have to change based upon legislation we passed here in Congress. And if we pass the browser legislation, as I hope we do, then to some extent I would imagine the business model has to change, perhaps not completely, but certainly any company has to operate within the parameters of the laws created by the Congress of the United States.
Do you have any concerns that Facebook will not be ready for the midterm elections? You know, Zuckerberg said they are working on new products, new tactics, new AI. He hopes it'll be ready by the midterms, but will it be?
I don't know. I certainly hope that it will be, because we want to make sure that the integrity of the process is protected.
We'll leave it there. Representative Leonard Lance, thank you so much for your time.
I'm Mark Crumpton in New York. You're watching Bloomberg Technology. Here's a check of First Word News. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin today told a House Appropriations Subcommittee that the United States may impose what he called very strong sanctions on Iran.
I think to the extent that the president decides not to sign the waiver and we do reimpose those sanctions, not only will there be primary sanctions, but there will be secondary sanctions. And I believe that they will continue to have a very strong impact on the economy in Iran.
President Trump has set a May 12th deadline to either improve or scrap the nuclear accord Tehran signed with 6 world powers, including the U.S. Saudi Arabia says it intercepted a ballistic missile over Riyadh and shot down 2 drones. It's the latest attack by Iranian-backed Yemeni rebels, showing improved military capabilities 3 years into the conflict. President Trump has signed a new law aimed at curbing sex trafficking. The law passed Congress overwhelmingly. It weakens a legal shield for online services that host abusive content, including sex trafficking. Thousands filled a stadium today in Soweto for a memorial service for Winnie Mandela, who died April 2nd at the age of 81. The ruling African National Congress, with which Mandela had a rocky relationship over the years, has held memorial events across South Africa, including today's ceremony and an official funeral scheduled for Saturday. I'm Mark Crumpton. It's just after 5:30 p.m. here in New York, 7:30 Thursday morning in Sydney, where my colleague Paul Allen has a look at the markets. Paul, good morning.
Morning, Mark. Well, all the major U.S. indexes ended up lower after, some tension in the Middle East, with President Trump warning that missiles are coming in Syria, and also the news that Paul Ryan won't be running for re-election. So we see there all the major indexes down, the Dow down by 0.9%, which is setting us up for a few declines here in the Asia-Pacific when we get going. We'll take a look at ASX futures, currently off about 1/10%. Nikkei futures traded out of Chicago also lower. And we see the Aussie dollar also halting its recent advance. This is after the Reserve Bank of Australia Governor Phil Lowe made some comments overnight about the risks of a trade war. We see the Japanese yen also strengthening against the US. Take a quick look at commodities. Oil surging, now the highest since 2014, not only on that tension in the Middle East, but also a Yemen missile attack on Saudi Arabia. Gold was up about 1%, but has recently edged back some of those gains. I'm Paul Allen in Sydney. More from Bloomberg Technology next.
This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Well, Mark Zuckerberg's time on Capitol Hill is over, and a new bill has already been introduced to protect consumer rights. The Consent Act, penned by Senators Blumenthal and Markey, would require the FTC to create new online privacy protections for users of sites like Facebook and Google. To discuss the last 2 days of hearings and what new laws might come out, I'd like to welcome a congressman whose district is located in the heart of Silicon Valley, Representative Ro Khanna of California's 17th District. Representative Khanna, you've been watching Mark Zuckerberg being grilled over the last 2 days. On what topics did you come away reassured? And on what topics did you come away more concerned?
Well, I was pleased that Mark Zuckerberg agreed to testify, that he subjected himself to 5 hours of testimony, both in the Senate and the House. This was long overdue. Facebook should have been testifying much earlier. And I was pleased that he's at least open to well-crafted regulations. I was concerned on two areas. One, it seemed that the Senate has a knowledge gap. Many of these senators haven't really used Facebook and Twitter, and it was apparent after they asked their first questions and Zuckerberg parried back, they were really unable to press him or get into the depth. And second, it's not Zuckerberg's job to just clean up the mess. It's Congress's job to regulate, to pass laws, to have strong protections. We're the ones who were elected to protect the American public. And there wasn't a sufficient commitment or discussion about what an Internet Bill of Rights would look like.
What should Congress do then?
Well, I think that there's some very common sense things that we ought to do. First, you ought to have a right to know your data. For example, if you want to know your financial information, you can go get your credit report. You can know who's asked for that credit information, who is trying to get information about you. You should have the ability to do that with all your data. You should be able to inquire of Facebook or Twitter or Google or Cambridge Analytica to give you a report of your data. We have these rights also for health. Second, you should be able to update your data. Third, you should be able to move your data, delete your data. Europe has a comprehensive set of these rights. I think the European regulation goes too far, but we should take some of those principles and have a robust framework here in the United States.
That said, we're talking about a massive data breach that happened on Facebook's platform, on Facebook's watch. We're talking about an election that was meddled in by, state actors on Facebook's watch. And in both cases, Facebook had warnings. Facebook knew about these issues before the company revealed them to the public. So where did Facebook fall short, in your opinion?
Well, they clearly did fall short, and they need to assume responsibility. First, they fell short in disclosure. All the reports I've read suggest that they should have, and they knew about this breach back in 2015. They didn't notify the users. They didn't notify the FTC. They didn't notify the press. Had they done that, a lot of the harms may have been avoided. Second, they clearly didn't have sufficient oversight. I mean, to have being paid in rubles and to have Russians buying ads and not knowing about that, or that not setting off alarm bells is deeply concerning. And third, they allowed false propaganda to spread and go viral on their social media site without any verification. I'm glad they are now owning up to the mistakes. I still believe in the power of social media to do good, but there were clear abuses, and they need to be transparent going forward and make real efforts to fix it. But that's not enough. Congress also needs to regulate. We can't rely on the self-regulation of Facebook or tech companies.
A lot of the questions today focused on Facebook's tracking of users off Facebook, including users who never signed up for it in the first place. Should Facebook be able to track user behavior across the internet off Facebook, even if they don't have a Facebook account, which means they could never agree to the terms of service?
Well, this is exactly why we need an Internet Bill of Rights. So, for example, if you use Firefox, the Mozilla browser, Facebook would never be able to do that because Firefox contains your data. Whereas if you use for the Safari browser, they may give the cookies or that data to Facebook if they have agreements with Facebook. And you actually have to go change on your iPhone the default settings on Safari to say, no, I don't want my data shared. This is what I mean where members of Congress need to be using these platforms more. They don't need to be computer scientists or coders, but they have to understand what these platforms do. And we need to then have laws saying, let's move to a world more like Mozilla Firefox, where users clearly have the right to know what's happening with their data and to have their data contained, so Facebook can't do these searches. It's why, for example, you could go on the internet, surf the internet and want to buy ties, and suddenly on Facebook, even though you've never liked ties, you start seeing ads pop up with ties and marketing them to you. And you say, why is that happening on Facebook? It's because Facebook often has information that advertisers have shared with them. And I do think an Internet Bill of Rights would stop that from happening.
You've said that we can't leave the security of our elections up to an internet entrepreneur. Facebook says it's working on new tools that will be in place before the midterm elections to prevent what happened in 2016 from happening again. Do you believe them? And if not, how concerning is that? And what can Congress do? Isn't it really on Facebook at this point to make sure that doesn't happen again?
I do believe they're acting in with good intent, but think about this, Emily. I mean, they've grown from a platform of a few 100,000 people to 2 billion people in 12 to 14 years. It's really an extraordinary platform, and it's an extraordinary problem. And I don't think we can just rely on Facebook's word. Congress needs to do two things. First, we need to significantly fund the National Science Foundation, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, research universities, so that we can do the type of research in machine learning, in artificial intelligence that is going to be necessary to protect our national security and to prevent this kind of Russian meddling or other types of interference. That's for Congress to make those kind of investments in research and in development, and we're not making those investments. Secondly, we need to have a right to individuals having a right to secure data and making sure that there are ad disclosures. Senator Klobuchar has a bill along that lines so that Facebook is required by law to comply, and that will put added incentive on their engineers to really come up with a solution if they have a legal liability that incentivizes them to do that.
But that's not necessarily going to happen before 2018, before November.
You're right. I mean, unfortunately, given the speed with which Congress moves, I'm not optimistic that these laws are going to be passed before that. And all I would say is until then, Congress should try to act as much as we can, because we are putting ourselves at risk without those laws. And I do hope that Facebook and other tech companies will realize that more of these breaches is going to further erode the public trust. These are platforms that largely were widely admired. I still think, as I travel around the country, there are a lot of people who look to tech with a positive framework, a positive sense, and they risk losing that if there are more and more of these breaches. So I think it is in Facebook's self-interest and a lot of tech companies' interest to put as much resources behind this to solve the problem. But it's not going to be easy, and there is vulnerability there.
Representative Ro Khanna, thank you so much, as always, for joining us today here on Bloomberg Technology.
Thanks for having me back on, Emily.
Well, in the battle for e-commerce supremacy in India, Walmart may be about to leave Amazon in its wake. India's leading e-commerce company, Flipkart, is said to be leaning towards selling to Walmart. This according to people familiar with the matter. Both companies are bidding for a controlling stake at a $20 billion valuation. That's $8 billion more than Flipkart's 2017 valuation. If completed, the deal would give Walmart a major stake in an emerging market of 1.3 billion people. Coming up, a blast from the past. Sprint and T-Mobile are in talks for a possible merger yet again. We'll bring you all the details. And as we head to break, take a look at this chart in the GTV library. This shows the net worth of Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, tied greatly to Facebook's stock price. It has taken a hit in recent weeks following the Cambridge Analytica data scandal. But you can see, highlighted there, an uptick the last few days through his testimony on Capitol Hill. This is Bloomberg. A major partnership in the streaming landscape, Spotify and Hulu announced solidifying their partnership by offering a bundle of both of their services to consumers for $12.99 a month. For that price, you get Spotify Premium and Hulu Video on Demand with ads. The two parties began first offering the bundle to students back in September, but they're expanding the promotion. Two of the largest wireless carriers in the United States are talking about a possible deal again. According to people familiar with the matter, Sprint and T-Mobile have restarted talks just 5 months after efforts to combine collapsed. At the time, the issue was how control of the combined company would be shared. Joining us now in London, Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde. So, Caroline, this has come up over and over again. It never happens. What could make this time any different?
Well, that's a key question, and whether or not we could see basically an agreement on price point. Why did it fall apart back in November 2017? The issue was one of control. But this time, the market's got excited all over again. It keeps coming back to haunt the market, and this time we saw yet another pop. What was it, 17% increase in Sprint's share price alone? I mean, that's about a $4 billion increase in its market capitalization. We saw T-Mobile also get a pop of some $3 billion. So there is hope there, clearly, and that's what's getting the market excited. They're hoping that you can get scale through this, because combining a number 3 and a number 4 player would help leapfrog it past AT&T. It would have about 100 million users. That's putting it ahead of the 93 million that AT&T have, just behind Verizon's more than 116 million users. But also you'd get scale, you'd get, of course, ability to be able to reduce their overall cost synergies, and also complementary spectrum here. They've got, in particular, an area of growth for 5G. It would really work by combining the two. The issue is, of course, regulation. This is what Jefferies is talking about. The analysts over there, once again, highlighting regulatory hurdles, saying, look, they're bigger than that of the AT&T and Time Warner deal, so spectrum would have to be sold.
So, obviously, the owner of T-Mobile, Deutsche Telecom, not going to let it go without a good price. You know, what could seal the deal?
Exactly that. Price, or indeed, as I say, the issue of control. Price point, we could see yet even more money being asked for T-Mobile US in particular. We've got another 40% pop being asked for by some analysts. We could see the share price go to 88 if there was some sort of deal. That's what analysts are saying. So premium is the only thing that really would allow the owner, Deutsche Telekom, to give over what is its main revenue-winning asset. This would have to either come at a big cost for SoftBank, the main controller of Sprint, or SoftBank's Masayoshi Son would have to decide that actually he would cede control. This was a stumbling block back in November 2017. They could not strike either a high enough price or an agreement to actually give the control to Deutsche Telekom, which is the biggest player in Germany, which owns T-Mobile. So we'd have to see either some sort of give on either of those points, price choice or control. Now, many analysts are saying you're likely to see the control be ceded by SoftBank instead. Why? Because of the debt pile that they've got. I bring you to the Bloomberg terminal. If you type in DDIS, this shows you the debt distribution of SoftBank. Check it out. Check out that number, particularly at the bottom. $125 billion is how much they have in debt. This could bring Masayoshi Son a little bit more eagerly to the discussion table. Emily.
All right, Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde. Thanks so much, Caroline. Stay with me. We're going to talk about what else but Facebook next. Coming up, overseas, European regulators were watching Mark Zuckerberg's testimony on Capitol Hill. We'll talk about what faces the social media giant in Europe next. Testimony there as well. This is Bloomberg. Cambridge Analytica has announced its acting CEO, Alexander Taylor, has stepped down to return to his former job at the company, Chief Data Officer. Taylor was named acting CEO March 20th when the board suspended Alexander Nix from that job. This after he was filmed talking about controversial methods used by the firms in political campaigns. According to several reports, Chairman Julian Wheatland is said to become the new CEO of the company. The Cambridge Analytica privacy scandal has been at the center of criticism of Facebook and has featured prominently in the 2 days of testimony this week by Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg before congressional committees. Speaking of Facebook, many reactions to Zuckerberg's testimony over the last 48 hours, including those in the EU. Europeans don't seem to be convinced. German Justice Minister Katharina Barley, critical of the CEO, she took to Twitter, citing Zuckerberg's pledge that he would accept responsibility for his company's failures, saying that apparently this hasn't been that important until now. Joining me now here in the studio, Bloomberg Gadfly's Alex Webb, still with us, Caroline Hyde in London. Alex, what is the reaction over in Europe, over these last 2 days of testimony and over these last couple of weeks where they have taken a much stronger line on privacy?
Yes, in Europe there is, of course, a far greater concern with privacy, particularly in Germany, as you mentioned, for, I think we've discussed in the past, historical reasons, which I think a lot of people know about. That has driven a new set of regulations on the European level, the General Data Protection Regulation. But in Europe, more broadly looking at Facebook, there's always been a certain question mark about why do Silicon Valley companies need so much data, and the question is, are they shutting the barn door well after the horse has bolted? And, is it too little, too late? Clearly better than nothing at all, but I think there is that certain sort of superciliousness in that respect.
Now, interestingly, Zuckerberg has said he thinks that Europe's data privacy rules and GDPR specifically is a standard that should be applied around the world and something that Facebook will apply around the world, whether or not U.S. lawmakers decide to do something similar. Caroline, also very interesting that Mark Zuckerberg was one of the Cambridge Analytica 87 million. So his data was potentially misused by Cambridge Analytica. What should we make of this leadership shuffle over there? Give us some more context.
Yeah, I think we've got to remember that Cambridge Analytica still feels that it has done no wrong. We keep on hearing from the company throughout this particular 2 days of testimony of Mark Zuckerberg. They've been claiming once again that we didn't break any laws, is what they've taken to Twitter, saying that overall they're saying that they didn't use this 87 million data treasure trove in the 2016 presidential election. They didn't use it in an EU referendum. And this is why I think we're seeing still so much shuffling at the top of Cambridge Analytica. We know that, as you say, Alexander Nix, who had been the helm, who had been caught on camera, particularly by a UK news organisation, the Channel 4 News, had secret video footage they took of him bragging about some of the more questionable tactics he uses in campaigns at Cambridge Analytica. He has now fully resigned. As we now know, the chief data officer who was acting as CEO has gone back to his usual role. I think it just means that there's yet more confusion at the helm of Cambridge Analytica.
So speaking of confusion, Zuckerberg says something very interesting today, that they're looking more deeply at Cambridge University and whether there is something bad going on more broadly. What did he mean by that?
Yeah, shock, horror at the very heart, throwing them under the bus, it would seem. The very vanguard of the academic institutions at the heart of the UK. And he's saying, questioning whether they're going to investigate researchers at Cambridge University. Remember, it was Alexander Kogan was at Cambridge University when he was doing these particular apps, inventing them, getting the data from these users. And notably, there was really firm rhetoric coming from Cambridge University itself in response to this. I say that they said they were really rather surprised that Mark Zuckerberg hadn't overall known about what was going on at the University of Cambridge. He himself is saying they need to understand whether you say something bad was going on at Cambridge University overall and whether they require stronger action from Facebook. Well, in response, Cambridge University says, look, we've made them aware. Not only have we written them a letter back on the 21st of March asking them, desiring them to provide evidence against Alexander Kogan, who, of course, was working at Cambridge University at the time. But they're also saying, look, we've been publishing findings of our data and our research since 2013. You should know about this.
All right, last quick question, Alex. We know Facebook executives, the CTO, is going to be testifying in the UK in a few weeks. We have 30 seconds left. How will it be different than what we've seen here in the US?
I think there will be... The problem here was there were a lot of different senators, a lot of different lawmakers asking questions, and they were constrained by time. They had 4 minutes today, 5 minutes yesterday each. That's very little. It meant that it was very hard to pose follow-up questions. In the UK, that's not going to be the case. There are fewer people on each select committee, a bit more time, and I think that gives them a far greater opportunity to really dig into the nitty-gritty and hopefully get more substantive answers, which Zuckerberg wasn't able to deliver today.
Right, rather than asking a question and saying, OK, well, you can come back to me with your answer. OK, Alex Webb, Bloomberg Gadfly, Caroline Hyde for Bloomberg in London. Thank you both. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology in New York. A reminder, we're live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology weekdays, 5 p.m. New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. That's all for now. This is Bloomberg.